All right. So, welcome everyone. We got a fair number of people here, which is great. We have Janine Castro speaking today, which should be a terrific talk. Um, Before we start, I did want to make a quick couple announcements. So, we have the Midwest Beaver Summit for 2025 is coming up, and that is going to be on June 5th. And it is um, it is both a virtual and in-person event. So it's June 5th. You can see the link there, and maybe we will throw it into the chat. But there's going to be some great speakers, some great breakout sessions. It sounds like a lot of fun. So hopefully people have a chance to check it out. And then the other one we have is the Southeast Virtual Beaver Summit, which is going to be on June 26th. And Sandra, now that you're here, did you want to give any plug for this?
This is our first Beaver Summit for the Southeast, and it will be a half-day event. And our goals is to gather as many people who are interested in beavers overall, but particularly beavers in the Southeast region of the United States, to start uh, gathering momentum to think about beaver coexistence in this region. And so there'll be several speakers and hopefully time for discussion. It's our first one, so.
That's great. Nice to have some, yeah, Southeast representation. So, yeah, so people should at least check those out. I think yeah, is it free? Yeah, there it is. Yes, registration is free. The Midwest Beaver Summit, I think, is $10 or something. But they both have some great speakers, so it should be a lot of fun. All right, and with that, I will stop sharing. And Janine, yeah, you can go ahead and put yours up whenever you like. And in the meantime, I will introduce Janine. So, yeah, I'm really excited to have Dr. Janine Castro, who's from Portland State University. And today she's going to be talking about landscape restoration gaps and habitat patches. We saw part of this talk at least, or some of the early ideas maybe, at the BeaverCon this year. And it's a terrific talk, some really cool ideas. So I hope there's some good discussion afterwards. Um, let's see. So Janine is a geomorphologist, and we're a technical director at the Portland State University, the River Restoration Professional Certification Program. She worked for the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service for 24 years, and is recently retired. And before that, she worked with the National Resource Conservation Services. She's put out just a number of beaver best management practice guides, research papers, really cool geomorph papers as well. Stream Evolution Triangle, if you're looking for some fun reading, that's a great one. So yeah, this should be a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to this. And with that, I will pass this over to you, Janine.
So today I want to talk about beaver migration, because beaver migrate, like so many other species, they have to have the freedom to move, to find food, to find resources, to find water, to find mates. So I feel like we talk about a lot of species, but we don't necessarily focus on migration. And I really got into this because you're going to hear more about the expert regional technical group that you see on my slide. And I'll introduce them here a bit later. But we focus on juvenile salmon migration. And then I just finished working on a paper right before I retired on fish passage in the Pacific Northwest for native species. And basically almost all fish migrate, maybe short distances, maybe long distances, but all species really need to move. They're fairly mobile to really complete their life cycle. And that's what I want to talk about today. But for all of you who are on this webinar or who are listening later, this is really a call to action. I think this is something that many of you could be working on to really help beaver recolonization into the future. So the idea of populating different areas, moving beaver around, translocation, it's been around a long time. And, there's some really fun stuff in the press with beaver parachuting. I mean, I think the public loves this kind of stuff. But as you know, many of you are working on translocation projects, and it is hard. And there's a pretty dark side of translocation, and that is really the mortality rates that we see. And while I am not arguing that we should stop doing this work. I think we should continue and we should keep working on it. Hopefully we'll get better. And you can see from this study by Petra and others in 2015 that kind of cumulative mortality on these projects, it can be 50%, it can be 100%. We need to get better than that. And so I think we are making progress. But really today I want to talk about recolonization. If we have a core population of beaver, how can we help them move kind of throughout the landscape, repopulate other areas where we don't actually have to physically move them? So, probably my most visceral experience, kind of late 90s. We were surveying this large meadow for river, the largest in the country at the time. So we're out there and it's winter time, it's cold. We're surveying across this beaver complex. And I guess the reason it's so visceral to me is one, I was freezing cold. And two, we're walking on the ponds and you could hear the ice groaning and cracking. And then once in a while you hear this big like sploosh and someone would fall through, one of the surveyors would fall through the ice and drop in about 3 feet. And so not a fatal move, but really uncomfortable. And that was really kind of my first experience dealing with beaver. And obviously it stuck with me. So McCoy Creek is in the upper Grand Ronde Basin in Northeast Oregon. And some of you have probably seen pictures of this. I use this example a lot because McCoy Creek suffered the same fate as so many other Western streams. It was straightened from top to bottom to increase arable land for grazing, for pastures. And this system I'm interpreting was probably a beaver meadow. And it was really interesting. It's kind of embarrassing, actually. A number of years ago, I was listening to a talk by Ellen Wohl on her Forgotten Legacies paper. So if you haven't read that paper, absolutely worth reading, particularly if you are interested in beaver. So when I was out there surveying on McCoy Creek, this is before we had LiDAR. So we thought we had some pretty decent surveys and we understood the topography. But when we did the project, we didn't capture some of the breaks in slope. And we thought, well, maybe there was a debris flow, maybe there are other things going on. But after listening to Ellen talk, I realized what we were seeing were old beaver dams, and they were still in the landscape, but they were subtle enough that we couldn't pick them up with our surveying methods. And now we can see them with LiDAR, which is really amazing. So the beaver pond kind of complex I was talking about is in this lower section, and this is where McCoy Creek goes into Meadow Creek. And so that's the area that we, at the time, when I started working in the late 1990s on this project, we had a big population down there that was fairly robust. And that's where the previous picture was from. But I want to show you kind of the restoration project that we started with in the upper part of McCoy Meadows, just above the road. So that red circle. So if we zoom in, this is McCoy Creek, and you can see the straightened channel and the historical channel kind of a little bit to the north. And this was exciting for me because I got to design kind of my first engineered log jam. We installed the log jam to essentially shunt the water into the old channel. And the reason I bring this up and why it was so fundamental, I think, in my understanding of landscape and landscape approach is because I'm a morphologist and I was always thinking about water and sediment. And our entire wasn't around beaver. But when I really came from the importance of the biology and the vegetation and beaver. And so we started seeing some reoccupation up in this area. And so if we kind of zoom back out and we look at this project, McCoy Creek was restored once with a channel reconstruction, and then there were side channels added. And then another engineer came in and put some large wood. But interestingly, through 20, 30 years of evolution of this project, when you kind of come to one of the most recent pictures, it's dry. It looks pretty dry. This should be a wet meadow. The money that paid for the original project was a wetland reserve program. So I still feel like we've learned a lot. The habitat's much better. The fish are using the area, but the meadow isn't wet and the beaver are gone. And there's a whole nother story associated with why the beaver are gone from McCoy Creek right now. A lot of it has to do with elk browsing and just the lack of food resources in this area. But that's not really what I want to talk about today, because I think that's something that we're kind of starting to address. What I really want to talk about is McCoy Meadows and another project that's 5 or 6 miles downstream. And this is Bird Track Springs on the Grand Ronde River. This was designed and kind of implemented by the Bureau of Reclamation. And so looking at this river, you can see all the side channels. You can see some pretty good riparian habitat. And as the beaver move into this area, we expect that maybe we can get a core population of beaver established here, which is fantastic. But maybe because I'm a geographer also by training, so my background is in geology and geography. As a geographer, I'm always kind of looking at patterns and I'm thinking about things spatially. So I'm curious, can a beaver move from Bird Track Springs to McCoy Meadows or back? How far can they move? How far do they migrate? So we've got these areas with some potentially really great habitat, but how do they get from one to the other? What are the mortality rates? And are there opportunities that we could actually help beaver move between two potentially core areas? Now, on the Grand Ronde River in this watershed, we are really lucky because we have the Confederated Tribes of the Umatilla Indian Reservation. They've done a ton of work out here. So this map is showing areas in blue, that restoration projects that have been implemented and are being monitored. The small green spot has been implemented, but they're not actively monitoring. And then red is planned restoration. I mean, this is a big watershed. These are some significant projects, and this doesn't include projects by other agencies like the Natural Resources Conservation Service on private lands, the Bureau of Reclamation. So I think we are getting to critical mass in some of our watersheds. And so my question is, well, how do we start linking them up? And that's really where this idea came from about stepping stones and gaps. So in really simple kind of terms, we identify gaps where species can't move. And we can do this for fish. It might be a dam and a barrier. We can do this for, I'll show you an example. What they did a study for monkeys. We can look at bears. We can look at any kind of species that migrates and figure out what are the gaps for that particular species for what part of their life stage. And for some of you, if you've been around a long time, you might remember back in the 70s and 80s, what was called the SLOSS debates. And this is a debate in ecology and conservation biology, debating about whether it's better to have a single large habitat unit or several small. So that's where SLOSS comes from, several single large or several small. What's better for biodiversity? And I wasn't part of that debate, but my take is, why wouldn't you just have both? Why do we have to choose? So you can see in this image that we've got two kind of habitat patches with some stepping stones, some small islands in between, and there's a critical gap. And so when we identify these gaps, like, how do we fill it? And in restoration, we would go in and do a project. If you think about beaver migration and thinking about what do they need to get across kind of this gap? Is it deeper water? Is it cover? But what can we provide to essentially kind of connect the dots? Because ideally what will happen is that these stepping stones will converge into a corridor, and then we'll get much better migration opportunity. But restoring corridors is difficult and it's really expensive. So often, and a lot of our work is opportunistic as well for dealing with private lands. So while ideal, probably not as practical or feasible as putting in these stepping stone patches. So this brought me to my next question. Well, how far do beaver migrate? And I called up Emily Fairfax and we exchanged some emails on the subject. And I asked a few other folks, like, what's out there? What papers are out there? What kind of research can we lean on to give us some insight about how far beaver can migrate? So one of the papers that I was directed to was a 2020 paper. And this one I think is interesting because it's looking at beaver dam complexes in Utah. And this just gave me an idea of how far beaver can kind of easily move between these three complexes because we know that the beaver are kind of moving around. But if you look at the scale, you can see that in meters, they're only 100 to maybe several hundred meters apart. But this is more kind of in that beaver complex. It's not when they're migrating to a new area. It's not like when the kids are leaving and they're trying to find new areas to occupy. And that's what I was interested in. But, you know, when you're doing this kind of research and you're reading things, I tend to go down these rabbit holes. And I came across another paper. This one, Emily referred me to, and this was back from McClintock in 2014. And I just found it fascinating because it's a study kind of looking at how far beaver will move from their lodge and how fast they move. And it's nearly a one-to-one line. And so I thought, this is fantastic. So if a beaver is moving 400 feet or 400 meters away from their lodge to find food or building materials, they're moving at about 400 meters per hour. And it just kind of scales down. If they're closer to home, they're moving slower. And I thought, this is beaver commute distance. This is how far they're willing to commute to get food, to get resources that they need. But again, that's really not what I was looking for, but I was just fascinated and I thought I would share that because it's really interesting thinking about a beaver complex and how far beaver will move. So I had to go back to a much older paper by Sun and others in 2000. And this is the dispersal pattern. And this is really what I was getting at. And some of you may be aware of other papers out there, other research. I'd be quite interested because while I did a bit of a search, I didn't do I didn't spend 40 hours looking at the literature. So there may be other papers out there that I missed. But back in 2000, there was a study that was done looking at dispersal. And we can see from this that males and females have different dispersal distances, but really up to 5 kilometers seems like if we found a gap greater than 5 kilometers, maybe we should think about putting in some sort of stepping stone. And this is kind of ironic because I'm going to share with you here in a little bit a project that I worked on with fish, and our gap distance, weirdly, is 5 kilometers. You can see that some beaver will disperse much further than that. Maybe they're a little bit more ambitious, braver, or maybe with different habitat types. I'm sure these numbers change. Some beaver may go much further, some may go much shorter. And I also don't know what the mortality rates are. So these are all areas that I think we could spend a lot more time kind of researching. Okay, so thinking about how far beaver will migrate when they disperse, that brings us to this idea of the stepping stone model. And I showed you kind of a very conceptual approach. This one's just a little bit more detailed. And this is a paper by Wang and others in 2023. And it's actually about monkey migration in China. But the approach, the framework, I think works very, very well. So the green boxes are essentially sustainable habitat, what I would call like habitat patches. We might have a core population of beaver there. And then we have these natural stepping stones in between that as beaver are moving, they can use those resources. And there may be gaps in there or areas of high mortality. And so what we would do is identify those gaps and create what Wang was calling artificial stepping stones, what we would probably call restoration projects. So we would try to put in some restoration projects, again, to connect the dots. And those dots essentially are showing this weak connectivity between those stepping stone habitats. Now, over time, hopefully those linkages would strengthen. And that might be through additional work. It might be because we get more flow into the river. So there's many reasons why we can start strengthening those connections. And then over time, kind of hypothetically, what would happen is maybe some of these stepping stone patches, they get bigger and they start interacting with closer patches and they create a small protected area. And then as it matures, ideally what we would have is another habitat patch, another sustainable area that perhaps we would get another core population. And from a migration standpoint, this is going to make migration much easier, and it should make mortality rates lower. And then if resources are used up in one habitat patch, it would allow beaver to move to these other areas. So essentially, really focusing on how do we help beaver move around the landscape while also reducing their mortality rates. So now I want to kind of shift and talk about a project that I've been working on for a number of years, and that's the Expert Regional Technical Group. You saw them on my first slide. We are a group of ecologists, fisheries biologists. I'm the geomorphologist on the group. We work in the lower Columbia River estuary and focus on juvenile salmonids. And you're probably thinking, how on earth are you going to link this to beaver? But I didn't step onto the ERTIG until about 2019. The ERTIG has been around since 2010, and it was established because of a biological opinion on salmon, essentially, for the Columbia Basin, and really having this kind of expert group technically reviewing proposed restoration projects in the Columbia River estuary. So the reason the ERTIG exists is probably fairly, you will not be surprised. So historically, the floodplain and their kind of tidal wetlands in the lower Columbia River were quite extensive. And over 100 years, we lost 68% of that tidal wetland floodplain habitat. And now we know how important that habitat is for salmon that are moving through the estuary, because all the salmon in the Columbia Basin have to move through the lower estuary, and this is an area that had high mortality. Okay, so to take you through kind of the setup and how we use our landscape approach, I want to share with you a project called the Shire. It's in the upper part of the estuary. The estuary, interestingly, goes all the way up to Bonneville Dam. That's the lowest dam in the Columbia River system. So it's the lower, I always forget how many miles, it's 150 miles of the Columbia River, and it's tidal actually all the way up to Bonneville Dam, which I find quite interesting. So this project is quite close to Bonneville Dam, and I'm going to kind of walk you through how we rated this project. But first, I want to mention, before I joined the ERTIG, projects were evaluated on the site scale basis. So each project kind of standalone. How big is it? We would look at things like success. How successful would the project be? Is there access for the fish? This is direct access. Can the juvenile salmon actually get into the habitat? And then the capacity. So that's really looking at how much primary productivity is, how much forage is available. So very focused on salmon and really site specific. And essentially what happened is these projects were scored. Now they're still scored on the site scale basis, but when I joined the ERTIG, it was about the time they took on this landscape scale approach, and they were really looking at landscape ecology. And that's what I guess I'm encouraging folks to really think about with beaver, is the landscape ecology kind of aspects and how we can help. So this is what the Shire looks like. Couple streams. This would be considered fairly small in the Columbia estuary. It's about 15 acres, and it's on the north side of the river. And you can see it's bound really between by that railroad, and there's Highway 14. So small area. And when we look at the project, basically the hatched blue area would be the new area of inundation with the project. That's the 15 acres. Okay, so we would score it, like I was showing you, kind of that site scale approach. And quite frankly, it probably wouldn't rate very well. Because it's artificial, we'd have to excavate bedrock. It wouldn't have access a lot of the time because the area is higher now that the hydrology of the Columbia River has changed. However, if we take a landscape scale approach, we developed this model. I'm essentially kind of thinking about the Columbia River. And I think you could do this really with any project if you're working in a basin and you're trying to figure out where to start working. And maybe not just being opportunistic, but maybe trying to target certain areas. So we did that with the estuary. We had our kind of initial condition, which essentially looks like a pipeline, right? It's just the main stem river, very little habitat, low residence time, low feeding opportunities for fish. They're just moving through. And it used to be thought that they would just book it on through, they just get out to the ocean as quick as possible. But the fish really need to transition because they're going into saltwater. So they need to spend time in the estuary feeding. And so the initial priority for these projects started with the tributaries. Where the tributaries are kind of coming in, these are areas of high biodiversity. We have primary productivity. So these are biological hotspots. So we really focused on those areas as high priorities. And then we really started looking at that stepping stone corridor. Okay, how far is it between tributaries? Can the fish get from one tributary to the next? And if you're this little tiny fish, you're a weak swimmer, so it's really tough. And that's where we came up with 5 kilometers. We decided a gap was 5 kilometers because that's about how far a fish will move in a tidal cycle, moving with the flow. So we used 5 kilometers as our gap. Not completely arbitrary, but we had to pick a number. And that's something I feel like we need to do with beaver. How far can they move? How do we identify a gap? So once we identified these gaps, then project proponents started looking for projects in those areas where there were big gaps. And then as the system is maturing, we're starting to see synergy between the habitat patches, longer residence time for these fish. So a lot of studies trying to figure out how long are they spending here, how fast are they growing, and we are definitely seeing this whole system maturing through time. So let's go back to the Shire. So the Shire is that little red blob in the middle of the map, right in here. And you can see that there are other projects. There's Steigerwald is a big restoration project, 1,200 acres downriver. And there's some projects across the way. So we're always kind of looking at that landscape perspective of where are these projects falling. And if we look at the map that we use to score, you can see that it's 15 acres and there's lots of information on here about gap sizes and the downstream shoreline gap. I'm going to walk you through that. And I'm going to show you how we score it because I think we could do this for beaver as well. Okay, so I'm going to take you through each of these columns and how we score. So you don't really need to look at all of it right now. So we'll bring up our map and let's just start with the first one. So we're going to look at connectivity and access for most species and populations. I already mentioned that for us, connectivity access means how close is it to the main stem? Well, for the Shire, it's right on the main stem, so it's very accessible, so it gets a 5. The next thing we look at is the location. And in the Columbia Estuary, there was work done. You might have noticed that we've got the 8 reaches. These were defined many, many years ago by Cy Simonstead and other researchers. And we decided that the fish that are coming out of Bonneville Dam maybe came through potentially several dams. That's a high priority area. That's kind of where the fish need to recover. And then that reaches right down by the ocean where they're transforming before they go out into saltwater. So these are our priority areas. So that's a fairly straightforward one for us. Like it's a 5 because it's in a priority reach. If we look at the habitat gap size, you're seeing that 5 kilometers. You're going to get a high score if you're filling a gap of more than 5 kilometers. Now, interestingly, we had a big discussion about this when we came up with it. The Shire is right here. And if you look at that downstream gap, that's that dashed red line. It's like 22 kilometers. That's a long way. But it's only filling a gap upstream of about 3 kilometers. So there's a 3-kilometer gap here and a big gap downriver. Because we're talking about really small fish, we're assuming they're not crossing the main stem Columbia River. So we're saying along one shoreline or along the other shoreline. So for this project, it gets a 4 because it's right here in the middle of 2.5 to 5 kilometers. The next one we look at is this proximity to a large tributary or significant reach transition. So I already mentioned how important those reaches were, and they were kind of defined by a group of folks way back. And these were important areas, kind of transitions that the fish would be going through. So we use that as, is it close to one of those transitions, is it close to a big tributary? Because remembering that those tributaries are areas of high biodiversity, the primary productivity and nutrients and so forth. And this project, actually, when we look at how far it is, well, the nearest tributary is the Washougal River at about 25 kilometers downriver. And we really don't have, we're far from this reach transition. So this one's getting a low score. It's greater than 5 kilometers, so it gets a 1. And then we just look at the tributary size, assuming that bigger tributaries are bringing in kind of more resources. And so we just looked at the Washougal and gave it a 3. But we're also interested in how big is that stepping stone patch size. It needs to be, if it's really small, it's harder for the fish to find it, to use it. So the assumption is the bigger the patch size, potentially the more accessible and useful it's going to be for the salmon. And so for this project, I mentioned it was 15 acres. That's right out in the middle there between that 10 and 20. And so that gives it a 3. And then finally, this is the one that is probably the most difficult to really put a number on. And that's the synergy with adjacent or nearby habitat or a restoration project. So this is like kind of the opposite of a gap. So it gets a high score because it's filling a gap, but we're also giving a higher score if it's close to a big habitat patch and we're getting synergy between. Because what that means is as these patches get bigger, then species don't have to move as far to access other resources. This is one I think with beaver would actually be a critical component. Thinking about these beaver meadows, if there's a single beaver dam or there are just a couple beaver dams versus a beaver meadow, a beaver complex, then maybe we can expand that complex. So it was interesting as we developed this, we said, well, if they're close by, maybe there's high synergy, but we didn't want to give a low score simply because it was a project sitting out by itself. So what we did is if a project was filling a gap, but had little synergy because it was so far away from other habitats, we essentially kind of gave it a neutral score of 2.5. So it's none or weak positive, none or weak negative. So we're right in that zone. So that's how we score it. And for the Shire, that gives it a score of a 3.4 for landscape. And you might be thinking, as we're scoring these things, that 3.4 is not very good. But in our system, that's actually quite good, quite important. And the reason, I think one of the main reasons I bring all of this up on the scoring and looking at these projects is really to defend small projects. Because when you're the Shire and you're 15 acres and you're competing against Steigerwald, a $30 million project, it's hard to get attention. It's hard to get funding. And so how do we look at these different projects and not just go for the kind of big, sexy project that everybody can support and they're like, absolutely, we should do this. And you've got the Shire that just doesn't get the attention, but it's in a critical location and it is so important. So these stepping stones, I feel like, are just as important as these big habitat patches because we need to be connecting them up. And so I think this is a way that we can evaluate projects. And I feel like it's more fair because we're giving credit for different things, different aspects of these projects. And so to wrap up, I wanted to show you kind of the success that we've had in the Columbia and lower Columbia River Estuary. And if you want to read more about this, there's the QR code there in the corner. But essentially, if we kind of look at the number of projects, just you can see the size of the projects, yellow or floodplain restoration, reconnection projects, removing levees and so forth. There are a lot of projects. And you can start imagining like, wow, we can connect these up now. I think, again, we are at critical mass. And in the program, which has existed for a little over 20 years now, I think we're over 90 projects. I think we're over 10,000 acres restored. And the thing that's really cool is we're now approaching the 20%. We've recovered 20% of the recoverable floodplain area. And what that means is the recoverable floodplain area is everything that isn't infrastructure or municipal areas. So we left the cities out. We left, the roads out, but this includes agricultural land, anything that could potentially be reconnected to the river. So 20%, I think, is quite impressive. So if you're working in an area, you're working in a watershed, and you've got lots of projects, I think looking at it spatially, start coming up with a plan of creating these stepping stones. And there's some really great data coming out of the Lower Columbia River. You can see it takes some time to get to this critical mass. So the program actually started back in the early 2000s. And you can just look at the top, you can see this kind of these yellow boxes. That's acquisitions. So just getting land that could be restored. But the last kind of 10 years has really been levee breaches. It's been replacing culverts. We've worked with the railroad. So now we're really seeing some incredible benefits. And you can see on the bottom graph as well that over time, we were kind of foundational building the program. We started getting enough projects. And now I feel like as things are maturing, we can start connecting things together and really improving kind of the connections and the migration between these stepping stones and habitat patches. So if you're interested in this and you want to read a bit more, there are a couple of publications I would lead you to. There's one about the expert panel process and how we function as a group. Probably not the most exciting read, but I think helpful if you're trying to set something like that up. And then a more recent paper that we published on the landscape ecology principles that we use to essentially give landscape scores on these projects in the estuary. And that lays out kind of what I've talked about, how we actually go through the scoring and more of the specifics. These are open source, so you should be able to find them easily. If you can't, please just send me an email. I'd be more than happy to share them with you. And now I have a shameless plug myself. I am the technical director of the Portland State River Restoration Professional Certificate Program, and we are super excited. We are just releasing our River Restoration Survey course, survey being kind of an overview of river restoration. This is really for a global audience, for folks who can't come to our in-person courses in the Pacific Northwest. This is completely online, asynchronous program, and we really are trying to reach an international audience. So if you know of anyone who might be interested, you have colleagues that work in other parts of the world, please let them know this is available. We are really trying to make it very, very affordable and accessible. So I'm going to leave you with a couple of thoughts about just summarizing what I've talked about on these stepping stones to support recolonization, to really support beaver migration and dispersal. The first one is just identifying where those habitat patches are. And I think many of you do this. We've got the BRAT model of where we can figure out where really good areas are. Assessing the connectivity. And I think this could be quite challenging because it's not like looking at fish barriers where, maybe there's a 3-foot jump. You're like, okay, fish can't get beyond this. I think understanding beaver migration, figuring out what those barriers might be.
Oh, hey, Janine. Sorry, the audio went out there briefly.
And then designing some stepping stones.
Excuse me, Janine. Sorry, the audio went out there just briefly. Would you mind just repeating that last one?
On number 3?
I think 2.
Sure. I'll just start over. Okay.
Yeah, sorry.
That's no problem. So kind of the stepping stones. The first one is identifying those existing sustainable habitat patches. And like I said, I think most of you probably have an idea of where those habitat patches are, where you have core populations of beaver. And then assessing the connectivity between the patches. So are there migration barriers for beaver? And I think that's going to be more challenging than figuring out migration barriers for fish. Because beaver are, they have lots of other options. But there may be areas of high mortality, and I think we really need to identify those gaps. And then designing stepping stones to link up the sustainable habitat. And so this might be things like creating deeper pools, putting in beaver dam analogs. It might even be having like food resources in between. So that's something I think all of you would be really great kind of working out what those needs are. And then evaluating the corridors. How do we strengthen those stable connections over time? And hopefully by linking them up, we want to really increase synergy. So ultimately what we're trying to do is establish new habitat patches, new conservation areas, and new kind of core populations of beaver. So if we lose beaver in other areas, we have dispersal to kind of repopulate over time. So with that, I'm going to leave you with a thought, and that is if beaver are to be successful over generations, they must have the freedom to migrate, and we can really help them bridge the gaps. Thanks.
Great, thank you. Yeah, thanks a lot, Janine. That was great, really interesting. If folks have questions, if you raise your hand, I can. Oh, we got one. Vanessa is on top of it. Just raise your.
I'll stop sharing. Although
You could keep it up if you want, just in case we need to go back.
okay, sure, yeah.
Um,
I won't tell you how much time I spent putting those little beaver faces on.
yeah, that's great. All right, Vanessa, you are unmuted.
Cool. Can you hear me, guys?
Gotcha.
So, first of all, that was an awesome presentation. It's great to see more folks talking about when we're thinking about promoting beaver presence on the landscape, we're thinking about what their needs are, especially with this habitat availability in addition to the connectivity piece. I will say, Janie, it's cool to see that you used the figure from research work I led with that cumulative mortality figure. So it's nice to see that you have value in that, which is pretty cool. But overall, one thing to consider too, thinking about this whole dispersal pattern, piece and thinking about the importance of small projects, which I think is a great idea and concept, and definitely very supportive of those smaller projects like you were describing, because of, again, it comes back to habitat availability and that connectivity piece. When thinking about movement, though, for beavers, especially with like dispersal patterns, those patterns, obviously are going to vary based off of where you are in a system, right? So in the case of like the Columbia River, I would suspect that, dispersal distances are going to be longer there as opposed to if you're further up in the watershed where the dispersal distances might be smaller. And also might depend on where there's other patches available habitat. And even with all of that, with going back to that connectivity piece, it's also thinking about then to the population dynamics as well. And so thinking about how carrying capacity at some point will influence, their dispersal distances, which I know, at least in the case of like work I've been associated with here in the Pacific Northwest, will typically average like 4 to 8 miles, which is pretty much online with those dispersal distances that you mentioned earlier, which were around like that 5 kilometer mark. One thing I'll note too, what's really cool, and this kind of ties back to, promotion of these stepping stones, was that through our landscape genetics work in Western Oregon, we found that through multiple generations of beavers that the genetic dispersal distance is about 40 miles, which is pretty interesting and kind of a testament to how much they can move across the landscape over time if there's available habitat for them to move into.
Oh, that's great.
So I guess with all that, it's not necessarily a question. It's more of like a compliment to you and like a fist pump. This is great work and keep it up.
Thanks. Yeah, and thanks for the information. And I mean, I suspect that, whether you're in an area that is really humid with a lot of vegetation cover, dispersal distances are going to be quite different. Like I would expect in the Southeast, quite different than what they are in like Central Oregon, where
Definitely.
there's availability and yeah.
Yep, fully highly variable across the landscape. Yep, just depends on the conditions. Yep, amongst many other things.
Yeah. And I kind of love that beaver make a fish migration look easy.
Yeah.
So I'm going to just when you say genetic dispersal is what is it, 40 kilometers? So is that saying that kind of that one family is going over that 40 kilometers?
So it's a genetic dispersal distance and it's 40 miles,
Oh,
not
so
40
40 miles.
kilometers. So what's that's saying is in terms of genetic relatedness, so multiple generations over time. Yeah. So you're going to find that genetic stamp, if you will, and within that 40-mile range, which shows how far they're moving over time, which is pretty cool. So like in the case of coastal basins in the Oregon coast, beavers are essentially, if you think about the length of those coastal basins, beavers over time across multiple generations, kind of like what we're seeing here in front of us, the Mind the Gap image. Beavers are moving from the headwaters down to the coastal estuaries and back and across, which is really neat.
Cool. So I guess I have a question. Sorry, Sandra, you can help me if other hands go up. So this is on a pretty large scale, and so I'm just curious about your thoughts on the smaller scale for, smaller restoration projects, especially if you are up in the headwaters. I'm thinking specifically about some projects where kind of from the headwaters, but they're coming down into some smaller towns before they maybe reach a main stem of something like the Colorado. Obviously, I have a specific example in mind. There's restoration projects where there's been some degradation to stream systems, and if you one way to do with this low-tech PBR, you can do some restoration relatively inexpensive, which means municipalities or smaller groups can take that on. If there's beavers nearby, in terms of like how large of a kind of stepping stone do you think would be reasonable? Like, could we get away with doing, fewer numbers of PALs and BDAs and just doing them, here and there? I mean, assuming whoever's paying for this has the time to wait for all of that to happen. Yeah, I'm just curious of what you think about just saying, okay, look, if you can't afford this, why don't we just put in just a few small complexes and we'll spread them out?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. I would throw it out to the group and other folks who are doing the research. Like, how big is a habitat patch? What qualifies as a patch? Like, where you could have a more stable population of beaver, and that I think also varies depending on the geography. So I think that's something we need to figure out. And it may be that you have a beaver population, like, okay, so how big is that patch that of the existing population that you have? Like, okay, I would kind of start with that. And then as far as a stepping stone, I think it depends, like how far can a beaver move during the dark, and do they need to stay over like throughout the day and have some cover and maybe have an area where they've just got enough cover that they can stay and then move the next day. Now, so this is getting kind of out of my area of expertise, certainly. But I think there are plenty of people out there on the phone who could really help with this. And I guess that's why I wanted to give the talk, is because I don't know, and I'm really curious. Like, we're doing these projects. For us in the Northwest, a lot of them are so salmon centric. But can we be doing something that's really going to help beaver as well? How big does the patch need to be, and how far apart? And what do these stepping stones look like?
Anyone got an answer for that? Please?
Anybody brave enough?
Yeah, a thought? Quiet group today.
You can ask Emily.
All right. Yep, Vanessa, you're still on.
Yeah, I was going to say, if no one else is going to jump at it, I can throw a comment into the ring here. So that I was thinking about that when you covered patch size, because this gets back to questions we've been having here in Oregon, Washington about, well, how much is enough, especially with these riparian planting projects. And now we're kind of stepping away from, we've identified habitat availability as a big piece to this connectivity equation, but now it's the question of habitat quality, right? So if you have higher habitat quality, they may be able to occupy a smaller footprint, but that's if there's enough vegetation to support them. And if we're looking for persistence over time in a habitat patch, and especially thinking about like how trying to decide or make these decisions on prioritizing different restoration projects based off of size and the amount of money you have to even do plantings, let's say. I think it kind of depends on the uplift. If you're at a site where you're starting from scratch, and there's a lot more biological uplift, if you are only able to, plant so many, stems of willow, you might end up with a situation where we've seen on some projects where you have an adjacent, family unit living within a mile or half mile of the site, and they're just coming down, consuming the vegetation that you just planted, and then leaving and going back home. And so that kind of ties back to, well, if you are going to undertake a planting, you should be thinking about density. So more, I guess, rule of thumb is I always argue more is better. And when you can cage to kind of help make sure that you're protecting some of your plantings, so that way they do persist over time, so that ultimately as the site itself responds and more, there's more availability of food resources, then that will kind of help them in the long term be able to move in and occupy it for a lengthy period of time to get those desired outcomes that we seek from their occupation, especially when there's damming activity involved.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. And I kind of have a similar perspective. There's power in numbers, right? If you can do more plantings, you can have more, if it's putting in BDAs or whatever, things blow out here and there, it happens. Yeah, I'm just curious, like, if you are saying, okay, look, we could really tackle doing quite a few, creating these complexes over 1 mile. Well, would you actually get more lift by saying, let's spread these out more than we maybe would have before and do it over 3 miles or more, and just having a larger gap in between and assuming that they'll be able to travel and hopefully, ideally, they would fill that in. Um,
Yeah, that
it's going to
actually
vary.
came up. That we had that discussion on our kind of landscape approach because, like, well, would we score differently if, let's say, we've got a 20-kilometer gap? So we score it higher if the stepping stone is at 10 kilometers. It gets a lower score if it's like at 3 kilometers because we're looking at how much are you splitting. And so I think, at least in our framework, you have kind of two habitat patches identified. And then ideally, if you only do one project, you can do it right in the middle. Or if you have two, so it's like spacing them out. And I mean, ideally, we would know how far the beaver could move with lower mortality rates. But I think without information, the best thing we could do is start breaking that up into pieces and making the gaps as short as we can.
So we have a question in the chat from Jim. And so his question is, here in Nevada, we do not have connectivity by water due to agriculture, drought, diversion, pumping, etc. Most of the headwater streams are isolated by extended dry travel. Has this been studied, to your knowledge?
Vanessa probably knows much better than I do, but I know there are studies out there on how far beaver can move kind of over land, over terrestrial areas. And I think the big question then is, are there other water sources? And that might be the stepping stone that's needed is a water source in between. But Vanessa, what are your thoughts on that? She went and got coffee.
Yep.
Sorry. I was answering another question here on my side. Forgive me. I think catching up here, the question is the one in the chat about headwater streams isolated, extended by dry travel. I'm not, sorry, I'm doing a Rolodex of research I'm aware of. I don't think so, or at least no studies come to mind. There could be one, a localized one that may be not as published. But I would assume you're then relying on the landscape level. What are other available water features that they could use to disperse across? Yeah, that's a good question. Sorry, I can't be more of help there.
That we have we have a lot of intermittent streams that might have a section with like a deeper pool. And so I'm thinking for a stepping stone, if there's an area where we could excavate out a deeper pool and access maybe the hyporheic zone in these areas that are dewatered, that might be a possibility. It would be really interesting to look at. It would be a great study to do.
Yeah, that'd be really interesting, right? If it's an intermittent stream, or can you put something in for the times when it is flowing, you're just going to have a pool there for longer.
Yeah, and
I'm
thinking
not
about
offering an answer. I'm I'm elaborating on the question.
well, I think it's a really interesting idea because I'm thinking about like with fish migration when we have intermittent streams And really what we try to do is make sure we've got deep pools that fish can survive over the summer. So is it deep enough? Is there enough cold water coming in? And I mean, honestly, we have a place in Central Oregon. We found a bull trout, which is extremely temperature sensitive, in July in this really deep pool. And it basically had his nose kind of tucked up right in this alluvial fan where this cold water was coming in. Couldn't go anywhere, but survived until the next flows in the fall.
Cool. Nessa, you can just keep talking at will.
I don't want to dominate this awesome Q&A session. One thing I just remembered, Janie jogged my mind. I know there's observations out of Central Oregon where, and this comes down, at least for here, I don't know about the case in Nevada, but the seasonality of water levels here. I know there's in some of the upper headwater streams where beavers will have, seasonal access to go back and forth between headwaters and the lowlands, but during the summer, they will become isolated to the point where they're holding out in like a couple of pools. And it's when through trail camera monitoring, folks have found that when beavers end up leaving those sites, they end up getting depredated by mountain lions when they're trying to seek water refuge elsewhere. And in doing so, with that, overland dry travel is when they're getting, unfortunately, predated upon them by everything that essentially loves to eat predators in the wildlife realm, unfortunately.
Oh, that brings up a really good question. I think that the other side of this whole approach is I think we need to be really careful not to create an attractive nuisance where we're getting beaver moving at times where they are going to be there are going to be high mortality levels. And I'm thinking, that maybe looking at the seasonality of movement when the kits are going to be kind of migrating out from kind of the home range. And so maybe instead of encouraging them to move during those times, perhaps kind of help expand the habitat that they're in so that they can survive over the summer.
I guess I just don't know what is the seasonality when they move, when the kids move out.
I'm looking at Vanessa, but she can't tell.
So I can mostly speak obviously for, the state of Oregon based off of our research work and other work I'm associated with, but it's typically you're going to see a large pulse of dispersal based movement in the spring. And then you're going to kind of see a second smaller pulse kind of late summer and the fall. And that one I would feel is more of like a representative of breeding dispersal events. But yes, the majority of them will be earlier in the year. And one thing to go back to the mention of being cautious about where we focus our time and not end up putting the beavers in a situation where they're more exposed or more likely to have higher mortality ties into conversations that several of us have been having in regards to thinking about ecological traps and whether or not we are potentially creating some of them on the landscape. And so thinking about that and not only recognizing it, but trying to build it into our criteria for thinking about where we want to choose to implement restoration efforts that get the most value and benefit to the beavers themselves. Does anybody else want to speak?
It's great having you here. Thank you.
I appreciate it.
We have any other questions? I'll just kind of add to, the trap. I mean, I think run into a lot of mortality where you have ranchers who don't want them near their ditches or things like that. And I'm just curious, this makes me think, I wonder if we could come to a nice agreement that maybe we can have, one small patch in through somebody's land, through the ranch land. Say, hey, how about we put a BDA here? We keep it away from your ditch. They're still gonna remove them if they come close to the ditch, but maybe just here's a little stopover, stop here, have a little pond, pool for shelter, and then keep moving. So I don't know if that would work or how sustainable.
Yeah, I think that's a really interesting idea because it could be a good conversation with the landowner and say, if they don't want beaver, in their irrigation ditch or wherever the water happens to be, it's like, well, let's create another area for them and try to pull them away from, provide better habitat so that they're not in the area that you don't want them. I mean, essentially, this is why a lot of wildlife refuges were established, was to pull birds from, agricultural fields into areas where they had more kind of natural habitat. So I think it's an interesting idea. I'm trying to think if there's, I don't know that I've worked on any projects like that. But it seems like that would be a much preferred alternative than having the landowners just kill a beaver.
Yeah. All right. Do we have any other questions, comments? All right. Well, with that, I think we can wrap it up for now. And I will just say, yeah, remember we've got these kind of two conferences coming up. We've got the Southeast Virtual Beaver Summit and the Midwest Beaver Summit coming up in June. We also have Dr. Emily Fairfax speaking on June 12th. She's going to talk about beavers, architects of climate resilience. So that should be another fun one. So I hope everyone can make it. I will throw the link to that in the chat as well. Yeah, so with
Right.
that,
I have one more actually. There
oh,
is a International Beaver Conference in September in Inverness in Scotland. So if anybody wants to go on a trip, it should be fantastic. There's been a lot of work going on in the UK and they're super excited. So I think it'll be a really fun conference.
yeah, that sounds great. I'd love to. Okay, I guess with that, yeah, thanks everyone, and thank you so much, Janine. That was really great. Yeah, raises a lot of questions, but yeah, some really exciting things to look into. So, thank you so much. I really appreciate it.
Do you mind if I drop your email in the chat?
Yeah, that's fine.
Okay, I have to find it. I don't know if you can find it faster, Brian.
I can drop it in the chat.
Okay, thank you. A couple people
Since
asked
I'm
if they'd like
retired
to
now.
contact you.
And we do finally have a little bit of a presence on the Beaver Institute website if you want to see our list of upcoming speakers that we're still filling in. I think it's under programs, I think, this science speaker series. And then if anyone would like to present or knows of folks who would, let us know. We're almost filled in this year, but then we will start in 2026, and we should make clear that it's open to anyone. You could be a researcher, a practitioner who's got some cool projects. We'd love to have this group be a resource for grad students. If you have an ongoing project and you want to present and pose questions to the group, we welcome it. So someday we'll have someone who's got some wild proposal they want to submit somewhere, and they want to use us to brainstorm. So, yeah, everyone's welcome. So, keep that in mind. All right. Well, thank you very much, everyone. Yeah, thanks again, Janine. That was terrific. A lot of fun.
Thanks, everyone.
Everyone.